That's the latest I've ever been. But I'm going to read you an essay, and it is called Love for One and All. It's really interesting. I wrote it in college, and I'm going to tell you lots of different things about love, and I wrote it to try to understand love. And I talk a little bit about Tolstoy, but if you don't know anything about Tolstoy, it's fine, because I'm going to tell you a little bit about Tolstoy. And I lost my voice today. Here we go. Love for one and all. Ghetto style in the ghetto. And I do have music. And it's starting to rain, so that's nice too. In Leo Tolstoy's literature, the concepts of love and marriage are presented in an unconventional manner. Tolstoy's assessment of the motive and act involved in romantic love toward another person is focused around the ideal of Christ. To live in accordance with Christ's ideal, Tolstoy believes that man must be eternally striving from dissipation towards greater and greater chastity in order for humanity to continue progressing. In Tolstoy's stories, Family Happiness and the Kreutzer Sonata, he illustrates this idea specifically through the union of marriage, concluding that there is no such thing as a, quote, Christian marriage. Tolstoy espouses carnal love and marriage are a degradation and sin. It makes perfect sense that to follow Christ's ideal, marriage does not even have a rightful place in the scheme of chastity and is something that we will somehow transcend, if only in the resurrection. For in the resurrection there is no such thing as marrying or be given in marriage. Men live like angels in heaven. The rudiments of Tolstoy's eventual complete redefinition of romantic and marital love are present even in his writing, even in his earlier works. A notion of self-sacrifice through love for another is conveyed in his writing as a necessity for a Christian love, portraying a romantic love in which one must not love for one's own pleasure, but loves for the other's pleasure. This type of romantic love is perhaps closer to the ideal of Christ Tolstoy upholds, through which people, rather than engaging in the struggle for existence, will with all their strength strive for a realization of love towards friends, towards enemies, towards every living thing. It is simply logical that Tolstoy cannot consider marriage to one other person a very chaste expenditure of personal energy. It is far more chaste to engage in the love of all, resulting in a real Christian marriage, a marriage to the whole world. The foundation for his philosophy that there is no Christian marriage is present in Tolstoy's 1859 novella, Family Happiness. Tolstoy's ideal manifestation of love for God's humanity is an all-encompassing and familial love in which one not permit thoughts about the possibility of intercourse with other men's wives in the same way that a man does not permit himself such a possibility between himself and his mother, his sisters, his relatives, and the wives of his friends. That would include his own wife, obviously. This form of love constitutes the family happiness that Tolstoy's antagonist of the self-same title's story discovers within the limits of her marital union, in contrast to the more giving nature of such familial love. The poetic and idealized interpretation and act of romantic and marital love that contemporary society reveres is at complete odds with Tolstoy's Christian ideal. Rather than endowing one with the desire to stretch one's love as far as it can go, potentially resulting in love toward God and one's neighbor, renunciation of self and service to God and one's neighbor, the assumed role of marital love as a natural part of life, and the practices therein, obliterates man's capacity to serve mankind on a greater scale, and specifically his service to God. Even if, within wedlock, one achieves a selfless understanding of and spiritual connection with another human being, the element of sexual desire inherent in romantic attachment and the dumbfounding ecstasy that accompanies the satiation of these desires are conducted through the most self-serving of all motivations. It seems only sensible that humanity recognize the selfish nature of romanticized love, considering that our modern values are, and perhaps always will be, a result of the values promoted through the Gospels, which Tolstoy aptly points out in his afterword to the Kreutzer Sonata. The teachings of the Gospel, which we profess, or at least, albeit unconsciously, recognize as the foundation of our morality, in the Gospel of Mark, when asked whether divorce is right, Jesus describes the divine purpose of marriage. From the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the twain shall become one flesh, so that in body they are no longer two people but one. This is why man must never separate what God has joined together. This description is much more suited to Tolstoy's views on marriage than our contemporary society's actualization of marriage. If this is what a Christian marriage is, then it seems that the marriage of the protagonist and his murdered wife in the Kreutzer Sonata is not truly joined by God. The marriage described in the Gospels is a state of union that is of both the physical and the metaphysical, in which the souls of the married couple become one. If this union can be actualized, then the two parties involved would be enabled to act as one self, thus extending their energies to other things outside of that self. But the way that our poetic ideal of romantic union is generally carried out is in opposition to this. The two people focus their energies on each other and attribute the oblivion they discover in one another to the truest of loves. This love is detrimental to the spiritual health of those involved and steals them from the world, sticking them completely into their selves, and can potentially lead to resentment. The protagonist of the Kreutzer Sonata recalls a moment in which he was able to see the inauthenticity of his love union with his wife, recalling that her whole face showed complete coldness and hostility, almost hatred. What, he thought. Love is a union of souls, and instead of that, there is this. The false implications of selflessness and meaningfulness attributed to the act of romantic union are illuminated upon by the protagonist of Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, who has murdered his own wife. The most exalted poetic love, as we call it, depends not on moral qualities, but on physical nearness, and on the coiffure and the color and cut of the dress. The Kreutzer Sonata takes the form of confession from a man that has become disillusioned by this faulty love only after it has poisoned him and led him to such irreversible extremes as the murder of his spouse. The end of the murderer's marriage in itself signifies that romantic expression and the accompanying impulses are little more than placing one's energy in the wrong place and playing with fire that need not be kindled. But Tolstoy explains in the afterword of the story that practically every married person is a murderer. He equates the act of love for pleasure with no biological consequences with murder, stating, "It is not good to employ means to prevent the birth of children in the first place, because this frees people from the care and labor over children, which serves as an expiation for carnal love, and secondly, because this is something quite close to an act most offensive to the human conscience, murder." This conclusion can be further applied from the act of romantic love to the idea of romantic love. A love that bears no fruit. Romantic love is like carnal love with contraceptives. Instead of acting as the seed to a capacity for the greater love that could be extended to the whole world, romantic love stays stagnated by an idea of fidelity that confines the force to only one other, the spouse. The murder that takes place in the story appears to be merely a symptom of romantic love and a metaphor for an emotional form of attachment that obliterates much more than it creates. The character of Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata exclaims early on that because since that episode occurred, my eyes have been opened and I have seen everything in quite a different light. Everything is reversed. Everything is reversed. But it is too late. Although the poor husband who has driven himself to murder through his marital concordance and the jealousy that arises from the oppression of his love can now see beyond that abyss of delusion in which we live regarding women and our relations with them. He has already ruined himself through his subscription to such ruinous notions of love in the first place. After maintaining this lofty notion his entire life, the character has cast it in stone through killing in the name of the idea. He has finally learned to disown the dangerous and consuming doctrine of romance, but at a cost that is too dear. Many of Tolstoy's characters are, on the contrary, seeking the fulfillment of a more spiritual love akin to that contained with Christ's ideal of brotherhood and chastity, but still in the form of romantic love for one other. In the Kreutzer Sonata, the bond that comes closest to this spiritual brotherhood is between the wife and her musical partner. This is the relationship that provokes so much jealousy in the murderous husband, and he explains the state of communion that people are capable of experiencing through music alone. Music carries me immediately and directly into the mental condition of the man who composed it. My soul merges with his, and together with him, I pass from one condition into another. But why this happens, I don't know. In the novella Family Happiness, the same revelation and disillusionment toward marriage and romance unfolds. From beginning to end, through the experience of the narrator. This story, written earlier than the Kreutzer Sonata, differs in the sense that the protagonist begins as a young girl who is seeking spiritual fulfillment and has not yet subscribed to the false notions of romantic love as a salvation. Masha, a young girl who loves solitude, nature, and God, eventually finds romantic love enticing and subsequently surrenders the expenditure of her energies toward endeavors that are fulfilling to herself to expenditures of romantic love in marriage. Through the duration of the story, Masha experiences the whole of falling in love, beginning as the tale of a young girl who gets betrothed with such ardor toward her newfound love, and ending as the account of an adult who experiences spiritual unfulfillment from a union that has fallen short of her poetic ideal. Family Happiness is successful, like the Kreutzer Sonata, in illustrating that wedlock and exclusive love for one other is the wrong conduit for human passions. We are taken with Masha on her journey through the illusions of romance and witness her developing consciousness concerning the selfish nature of an attachment. Our plans for the ordering of our life in the country turned out quite differently from what we had expected. But the reality was all we had ever dreamed of. There was none of the unremitting turmoil, the doing of one's duty, the self-sacrifice and living for others which I had pictured to myself before our marriage. There was, on the contrary, an entirely absorbing and selfish affection for one another, a desire to be loved, unreasoning, constant gaiety, and oblivion of all else in the world. That poetic love is one in which the parties involved surrender to each other and shut off to the existence, pain, suffering, and necessities of others in the world. It is an act of such lofty and idealized love that Tolstoy treats so harshly. Such rapture and oblivion is the result of a purely selfish motivation. In contrast, the selfless ideal of Christ is interpreted by Tolstoy as the spiritual love for all, and is the real love that the disillusioned wife in Family Happiness realizes she cannot attain through her marriage alone. Even as a passionate youth, Masha possessed within her the desire to sacrifice herself and live for the benefit of mankind. Despite this drive, she subscribed to the belief that it was natural to exercise these passions through an exclusive love for another human being. As a result, instead of using these creative impulses for a greater purpose outside of the individual, they died within her in wedlock. The impulses never found a suitable conduit to be released from within her, and eventually drowned beneath the consuming fierceness of romantic rapture. Masha's marriage, like that of most everyone, was a completely selfish act. all of her energies expended therein were degraded to the sole level of pleasure for the self and ill applied to personal desires and agenda typos. Embracing such a selfish inclination eventually leads Masha to all sorts of hedonistic pleasures, and she becomes addicted to vice and sensual living in her search for fulfillment. Fashionable life, which had dazzled me at first by its glitter and flattery of my self-love, now took entire command of my nature, became a habit, laid its fetters upon me, and monopolized my capacity for feeling. I could not bear solitude and was afraid to reflect on my position. Exclusive love for Masha's spouse opened up the door to an escape for the self at all times, and an oblivion to the responsibility to her own spiritual maintenance. She succumbs to the living on the surface of herself and extends the oblivion experienced through romantic rapture to an oblivion even to that romance, living in a new state of neglect that never would have taken root in Masha if she had not subordinated her spiritual self to her sensual self. Tolstoy rejects such selfish desires as a means of conduct, believing that a human being should be led by a desire to serve everyone and God. As Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, "No, whoever among you wants to be great must become the servant of you all. And if he wants to be first among you, he must be your slave, just as the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life to set many others free. If any man wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all. Not oneself and one other." What can such a union do in terms of the progression of mankind and the world? Our capacity to love that we fetter and shackle through marriage is akin to Jesus' description of the light in the Gospel of Mark. Is a lamp brought into a room to be put under a bucket or underneath a bed? Surely its place is on the lampstand. The great love that humanity is capable of feeling and doing great things for the world with is wasted in marriage, put under a bucket, and left to rot in the corner of a house with the bride and the groom. Tolstoy is firm in his stance that mankind should strive for something more meaningful than the pursuance and painstaking sustenance of a sensual impulse that is imposed onto a second party and left in its microcosmic state. Moreover, he views carnal love, which cannot be disentangled from wedlock in its current form, as the lowest common denominator of sensual impulses. But the idea of marital love as a goal is something that is socially ingrained in man, and it is therefore difficult for one to realize that perhaps romance and rearing a nuclear family are not... Wait. Where the hell am I? Are not... Oh. The spiritual and life-affirming ends of a successful life. In the afterword to Tolstoy's The Kreutzer Sonata, which was written in response to the highly controversial effect the novella had on its audience, the author directly addresses this crisis. We must stop thinking that carnal love is something especially elevated and must understand that the goal worthy of man, whether it is service to humanity, to country, to science, to art, to say nothing of service to God, no matter what it is, as long as we consider it worthy of man, cannot be achieved by means of a union with the object of love in marriage or outside it. Much like Dostoevsky's emphasis on the personal self and the divine self as existing simultaneously within man's consciousness, thus creating a struggle between mankind's motives and actions, Tolstoy's philosophies on love and human conduct rest upon a notion of metaphysical total unity of the divine, human, and natural realms, focusing on the distinction between the animal, personal, individual self and the true, divine, common self. It follows then that the desire present in romantic love comes from the animal self. In contrast, a desire to alleviate the suffering of others, specifically those we do not even know, and the total devotion of oneself to the benefit of all or God, is a compulsion of the divine self. The concept of Tolstoy's animal self and divine self, joined in a metaphysical total unity, can be further understood by the following statement. Every human being partakes in both this ideal world and this fallen real world. For Tolstoy, the human being has an animal, personal, individual self, which he understands as a mode of living for self, and a true divine common self, which he understands as a mode or of living for all. The animal self lives by sexual love for one or many. The divine self lives by spiritual love for all. And the purpose of life is to clarify identity by subordinating the personality to the divine self. Tolstoy often refers to instances of giving into sensual desire as a fall, similar to Camus' fall from grace and goodness that is described in his literature. Tolstoy preaches for chastity and abstinence, especially within wedlock. His wish for civilized society is that men and women would be educated in their families and through social opinion, so that both before and after marriage they would not regard falling in love and that carnal love connected with it as a poetic and elevated state as they look at it now, but rather as a state of bestiality degrading for a human being. End quote. A chaste form of love, like that represented by Christ's ideal, is one which, quote, carnal love, end quote, is, quote, substituted with the pure relations of sister and brother, end quote. Tolstoy supports this interpretation of sensual love as anti-Christian by drawing from the Gospels, in which the idea is presented that a man in general, whether married or unmarried, who looks at a woman as an object of pleasure is sinning. This is the fall from grace that is described in the Kreutzer Sonata when the protagonist, a man who has fallen himself, recounts the story from his youth of a visit to a brothel with his brother. We went. My brother was still innocent, and he fell that same night. And I, a 15-year-old boy, defiled myself and took part in defiling a woman without at all understanding what I was doing. Though the protagonist of the Kreutzer Sonata learned this lesson in chastity at a young age, he failed to make the connection that the sexual defiling of a stranger in a brothel is scarcely any different than the defiling of his own wife. Tolstoy believes that marital sensuality is simply arranged debauchery. Take that, Christians. And Tolstoy's belief concerning the union of wedlock is predicated upon his theory that church teachings, not the teaching of Christ, establish marriage as a Christian institution. They set external conditions under which carnal love can be enjoyed without sin by the Christian and can be completely lawful. When Masha is tempted in family happiness by another man in a moment of sensual weakness, she describes her desire as being tempted to throw herself headlong into the abyss of forbidden delights that had suddenly opened up before me. But what she doesn't realize is that she has already been in that abyss of forbidden delights within wedlock. If one should, as Tolstoy and the doctrine of Christ indicate, love every person and animal with the same all-inclusive love that is free of sensuality and can be applied to both wife and sister alike, then any sensual love is a type of deviation from goodness and progression. The sexual consumption of another is not a moderate act, and Tolstoy rightly points out that the ridiculousness of sex as viewed as necessary to one's health when he equates the act as vampirism, stating that it cannot be that it is necessary for the sake of the health of some people to destroy the body and soul of other people in the same way that it cannot be necessary for the sake of the health of some people to drink the blood of others. The motive within wedlock that is closest in semblance to the all-inclusive love present in the ideal of Christ, according to Tolstoy, is the experience of parenthood. This is the only catalyst spurned from a romantic union in which the motive for the union is no longer merely to maintain a state of pleasure and happiness through one another. Parenthood and child rearing are, rather, a functional and more selfless form of love for another through which one must sacrifice the pursuit of personal happiness for the happiness and well-being of others. But it is still not a truly selfless love because it revolves around the existence of the individual and the personal self. In the afterword to the Kreutzer Sonata, Tolstoy explains the concept of child rearing as the most selfless of selfish acts within wedlock. Marriage, within the consequence that attends it, the birth of children, defines for those entering into it a new, more limited form of service to God and people. Until marriage takes place, a person can spontaneously and in the most varied forms be of service to God and people. Entering into marriage limits the sphere of one's activity, obligating one to rear and educate the progeny that result from the marriage, who are future servants of God and people. In his earlier work of family happiness, before his complete denouncement of the institution of marriage as anti-Christian, Tolstoy's emphasis on the importance of child rearing and the bond it forges between a husband and wife is evident. I'm almost done, don't worry. In the end of the story, after Masha has lost all hope for the fulfilling element of her love toward her husband, she finally finds the greater love in the world through putting her idealized romance to rest. My husband came up to me, and I quickly covered the child's face and uncovered it again. "Ivan Sergeyich," said my husband, tickling him under the chin. I glanced at my husband. His eyes smiled as he looked at me, and I looked into them with an ease and happiness which I had not felt for a long time. This form of love proves to be that which Masha's husband has been seeking all along, and he explains to her right before her revelation that each time of life has its own kind of love. Even the wicked murderer from the Kreutzer Sonata found a solace in his child rearing with his wife that he could not find in his romance with her. As pessimistic as his account of child rearing sounds, only her pregnancy and the nursing of her babies saved me from the torments of jealousy. The children saved me and her. The murderer comments on the salvation of raising children one more time in the story, proclaiming that when the doctor had advised his wife to cease having children, the last excuse for our swinish life, children, was then taken away, and life became viler than ever. In Tolstoy's literature on marriage, it is only the experience of raising a family that finally bridges the spiritual gap between the spouses and allows them to see the shortcomings of romantic love in the face of a more inclusive and selfless manifestation of love for the children. In an excerpt from his complete works taken from 1856, Tolstoy writes that besides the destined purpose of a woman to be a wife, her main purpose is to be a mother, and to be a mother and not a female, you need development. Though it becomes clear from Tolstoy's later works that his views had gradually evolved to a more radical outlook on the matter, and he could not longer ascertain that the purpose of a woman is merely to be a wife and a mother, he would certainly still maintain the conviction that it is far more important for a wife to be a mother and not a female. Tolstoy's explicit differentiation between mother and female seems to refer to the difference between a woman as being a benefactor to mankind and her kin, and a woman as being a symbol or a provoker of sensuality, and a benefactor to just the self in a pleasure-oriented manner. Giving birth is the action that calls upon a woman within the limited expression of wedlock to become a mother, a benefactor of others. This redemptive aspect of child rearing, when introduced to a marriage, is described in the ending of Tolstoy's novella, Family Happiness. That day ended the romance of our marriage. What was my past became a precious, irrecoverable memory, while a new kind of love for my children and the father of my children laid the foundation of a new life and a quite different happiness, which I am still enjoying at the moment. With that ellipsis, the story that, up until that point, had appeared to be spiraling into the character's irreversible unhappiness takes a new turn. The ellipsis implies that, though reached through the union of marriage, which is restrictive to the potential of a human being to be beneficial to mankind in the world, Masha was indeed able to discover a form of love that more closely reflected the ideal of Christ's chaste love. Though limited to the nuclear family and thus not extended to all of mankind, the form of love that Masha had discovered through caring for her children and the new relationship to her husband created through that shared responsibility and bond is the love that Jesus strived to impart unto humanity, the ideal to complete chastity and brotherly love of the kingdom of heaven on earth. The freaking end. Okay, bye. God, now I have to go read on Instagram and I feel like I'm gonna die. How did you